Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Gina Smarecki. I am the events manager here at Nuspire, and I'll be your host for today's live session. Today's webinar is one of our most attended topics each quarter as we look at Nuspire's threat findings from last quarter and share our analysis on the current trends in cybercrime. So today we'll be taking a look at the newest data from Q3 of this year. Brand new, the full threat landscape report went live this morning and is now available to download from our website. And so I'd like to go ahead and share this link to that out to everyone in the chat in case you're interested in taking a look there. It'll also come out in the email that we send tomorrow. But that is there in case anyone is interested. If you have questions during today's presentation, go ahead and put them in the Q&A tab on the bottom of the screen. We'll be trying to leave a few minutes at the end for any questions. And just so you know, we will send out an email tomorrow with the recording as well. It is my pleasure at this time to introduce you to our speakers today, Justin Hurd and Josh Smith. For Justin, he is the Director of Security Operations at Nuspire. Justin brings over 15 years of cybersecurity experience. His career has been characterized by excellence in a variety range of roles, everything from threat hunter to incident commander and intelligence analyst. His extensive knowledge and versatile skill set, he stands as a genuine authority in the field of security operations and is dedicated to continuously enhancing our organization's defensive capabilities in response to the ever-evolving threats. We have Josh Smith. Josh is our principal threat intelligence analyst here. He works closely in organizational threat landscapes, curating threat intelligence, and authoring Nuspire's quarterly threat landscape report. Josh now holds a master's degree in cybersecurity technology, and he previously served with the U.S. Navy as an operations specialist with 14 years of service. Josh has been quoted in Forbes, CSO Online, Channel Futures, Dark Reading, Motor Magazine, and many others. So at that, without any further ado, I will turn it over to Josh to kick things off.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you everyone for attending. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're from. And I just want to cover very quickly what our agenda for today will be. First, we're going to cover our methodology and overview, how we come up with the data, and basically how do we create this report. After that, we'll jump into our 3 different data sets. That's going to be our ransomware section, our dark web section, and our exploit section. At the end of each one of those sections, Justin will jump in and give some proactive detections and mitigation measures that you can take regarding those things. And then afterwards, we'll wrap everything up with a bow and kind of cover all of our conclusions and recommendations again. I'll turn it over to Justin for our methodology and overview.
Yep, thank you, Josh, and thank you, Gina, for that introduction. We'll talk a little bit about the methodologies and overview of how we collect the data and why we collect it to bring it into the report for you today. This will closely mimic the threat intelligence lifecycle. We're gathering all the information via open sources, via our data. So we have data around different firewalls, devices, endpoints. We're basing this off of research based off of other researchers that we may come across, matching that against real-time data for threats that we're seeing, building kind of trends over time of what that looks like and seeing if we can detect where those differences are. That's kind of the evaluation part. And then the dissemination is here today. So we're putting that all together, all that analysis, all that data gathering. We have Josh here, an expert looking at the different trends and how things are moving to bring that here to you today for our Q3 threat report. So I'll pass it over to Josh to kind of dig into the meat of the report. Thank you.
All right, and kick off with our first section. We'll go through our ransomware data. Overall, we saw for the quarter about 1,500, a little over that, in ransomware publications. What that specifically means, a ransomware publication, there may be numerous amounts of attacks that happen out there in the world that may get stopped somewhere within the kill chain. A ransomware publication is where the ransomware operators have actually exfiltrated data and they are now publishing that on their extortion website. We feel that's a good metric to be able to get an idea of what kind of attacks were successful. And it also kind of gives you an idea of what industries were involved in those types of attacks from that data. So when we compare those kinds of numbers against Q2, we did see an 8% increase overall. We look at our top 5 ransomware organizations that from those publishings. Our top one this quarter was Ransom Hub. Previously, Lockbit ransomware organization had dominated our reports quarter after quarter after quarter. Throughout 2024, they've faced significant law enforcement pressure from servers being seized to administrators being publicly announced with rewards being offered for their whereabouts. That seems to have taken effect. They have dramatically dropped their activity compared to where we've seen by about 52%. They are still active, though, regardless of that law enforcement pressure, but it was enough to get Ransom Hub to be able to overtake them and now become the new leader, if you will, within the quarter. There's a new entry to the group as well, Meow Ransomware. It's been around since roughly 2022, but in Q2, for example, we didn't see any publications from them at all. Come Q3, they've now significantly jumped up, and so they appear to be gathering steam and finding success. So when we jump to our top offender for the quarter, Ransom Hub. Ransom Hub ransomware, it operates as what's called a ransomware as a service. Think of it like an organization where basically these affiliates or bad threat actors can contact Ransom Hub and purchase a copy of their ransomware. Afterwards, these affiliates can launch attacks in really any method they desire. And if they're successful in their attack, they cut a percentage of the ransomware payment back to Ransom Hub. Through these sorts of ransomware as a service, these operators will give them technical support, best case scenarios, lessons learned in other attacks, and things like that, and have really modernized and businessed these types of ransomware events. Because of that, it can be difficult at times to track how exactly the tactics, techniques, and procedures come from these affiliates because they're all kind of rogue agents. But with that being said, some of the top things that were witnessed from these different Ransom Hub attacks for these common attack vectors were phishing emails, exploiting known vulnerabilities, and specifically password spraying from known database breaches. I don't think that's really a major surprise. That's a lot of different attack vectors these days that threat actors are using because they still work. Other things, too, that we saw Ransom Hub doing was targeting some different vulnerabilities that have been pretty old at this point. There's the Citrix ADC vulnerability that's a remote code execution. There's some Fortinet FortiOS vulnerabilities from 2023 that they were looking at. Java ones, zero logon privilege escalations. There's a whole list within the report itself that you can take a look at those CVEs. I highly recommend you do, and if you're affected by any of those, you definitely want to get those patched as soon as possible because these guys are looking for that and looking to exploit it. As we take a look now at ransomware extortion, specifically by industry, typically what we've seen for the past few quarters is the manufacturing sector was the top sector. Professional and technical services has overtaken them this quarter. And what that looks like, that industry, to give some examples, that's things like HR departments, accounting organizations, law offices, things of that nature. Those services that provide support to businesses. One of the reasons why, very obviously, they handle very sensitive data. And if they can get into that organization and exfiltrate that data, that sensitivity based around those things may encourage the organization to pay out more than maybe someone else. The other side of that, too, is even if they aren't able to get a successful negotiation because of that, that's a lot of goldmine data for them that they can use to attack other organizations that they got that out of. It gives a lot of PII, so it gives a lot of usernames or potential usernames, different things for password resets, those security questions that people have. So it gives them a lot of goldmine data to be able to further launch attacks if they're unable to get the extortion. And a lot of these businesses tend to be also small and medium size. And with that, there's struggles for small and medium businesses for cybersecurity when it comes to budgeting or having outdated technology. And generally speaking, you're going to find that ransomware operators are going to be targeting the easiest victims they can. We constantly say in all of our webinars for this topic, the low-hanging fruit. I'm sure you'll hear Justin say it at some point as well too. But financially driven threat actors are typically going to go the path of least resistance. And if that's small and medium businesses, that's where they'll go to. And from here, I'll jump back over to Justin and let him cover the mitigation and response.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah, so for ransomware mitigation and response, a big portion of a lot of the activity happens with that. So if we take away the initial access, which is essentially a lot of times phishing or drive-by downloads or exploiting some known vulnerability, which we'll talk a little bit about vulnerabilities later on. A lot of the actions that take place on the endpoint itself. So, the user clicks on a phishing email, gets something on their machine. Now things are taking place on their machine. The EDR agents, or endpoint detection and response, is a really good way to identify not just the malware packages or the hashes related to those, but the actual techniques and tactics that are being used by those threat actors to do different things on the system, such as install persistence mechanisms, execute payloads, laterally move to other systems. So maybe it starts on a low, starts on just a regular user PC, but gets to an admin user's PC through lateral movement. And so EDRs are really good at detecting those techniques, and monitoring those techniques and tactics can give you an early response to ransomware in general. The biggest thing and the first thing we ask anytime we work with someone who's been hit by ransomware is, do you have backups? It's really the only way to recover from a ransomware. You'll hear, whispers in the hallways about, oh, there's a decryption key for that. They typically don't work, or they don't work as well. And then you never really know what you're downloading when you download it. So essentially, if you do not have backups of your data, it's very difficult and mostly impossible to recover without completely rebuilding the systems. So that's very important. Having those contingency plans for the data and recovery plans for getting back up to speed if you are to be attacked by ransomware. And the last one here, we talked about the initial access point of ransomware being phishing, drive-by downloads, previously known CVEs. Those things all have to do, or mostly have to do, with users. And so making sure users always have a security mindset when they're clicking on things. Josh talked about HR and some of those professional services being targeted a lot more. They're targeting the users. It's usually the easiest way in, bar a known vulnerability. And they use it quite often. It's really easy to deploy across a lot of people. So just throwing your fishing pole, throwing multiple fishing poles out there and just seeing who's going to bite, and then attacking from there. So cybersecurity awareness and training is very important way to try to mitigate ransomware.
And moving on to our next section, dark web. One of the things that, or one of the reasons why we track this data is a lot of what Justin just said too about, obviously a threat actor may go after a known exploit out there. It's so much easier though if you just have valid credentials. You don't have to have the technical know-how to exploit a system. You don't have to try to research out a 0-day or hope that the organization's not patched against your attack. If you have someone's valid credentials, you can just walk right in the door. So one of the reasons why we track the dark web, and also we'll talk about here is info stealers specifically, is for that reason. When we take our numbers from Q3 compared to Q2, we did see a slight decrease in overall postings across our dark web sources. But nonetheless, it's still very prevalent if you look through those numbers there of all the different things just within a single quarter that were listed on a dark web marketplace for sale. There we go. Sorry, wouldn't jump into the next slide there. So we take a look at our top 5 info stealers for the dark web. Specifically, you can see Luma Stealer dominates when it comes to anything else. Luma Stealer's been around for quite a while. It fell off a little bit in Q2 and has made another resurgence again here in Q3. Redline has always kind of been one of the ones that had competed with it, and it's been slowly decreasing. And in fact, I think it was just a couple days ago, a report came out that law enforcement had seized a bunch of Redline servers. So I would be surprised to see if that didn't impact things come next quarter. And as we talk about Luma Stealers specifically here, info stealers in general, though, are very popular with threat actors because of their ability to harvest sensitive data, specifically stored credentials and financial information. What these usually are looking for is specific files that are within a victim's device, or it's also looking within the browser itself for all those information or all those credentials that have been saved within a browser every time you're on Google Chrome or your browser of choice, and that little box pops up and asks if you want to save the credentials into it. They want to scrape all that stuff out of there, as well as they'll take the cookies and all that information too. They bundle it up, and one of the most frequent places we see that sold is a market called Russian Market. Luma Stealer is very frequently posted on there. Some of these postings are as cheap as $10 for a threat actor to go in there and just purchase someone's browser scrapings, and from there they can try to see if there's something useful for them to launch an attack. Those people that are selling that information are what we call initial access brokers, and they're a part of the ecosystem of cybercrime where they gain access into a system. They don't want to accept the risk or go forward with launching an attack, whether that be they just don't want to do it, they don't want the law enforcement pressure, or they just want to make a quick buck. So they bundle all that stuff up and sell it, and then ransomware affiliates or whoever can go along and buy that stuff and test it out from there to be able to see if they can gain access with it. So, I mean, with that being said, also, Russian Market is a private access marketplace. It does require users to go ahead and deposit cryptocurrency to even be able to get in there and see things. And once they do, though, like I said, they can buy not only stuff like InfoStealer data, but they can find credit card details, RDP access if that's available. They sell hacking tools and all kinds of things like that. So it's kind of a one-stop shop, and it's a very, very popular market. Now I'll pass that back over to Justin.
Yeah, so when we're talking about dark web mitigation response and things that we can do, a lot of the same actions will come into play. User awareness, not reusing passwords is something that always comes to mind for me. If a user uses the same password for their corporate accounts as they are their personal accounts, and their personal accounts get the credentials get stolen through a stealer, some type of Trojan browser extension, so on and so forth, those credentials can be used elsewhere, right? It's pretty easy to make those connections between people in the places that they work via social media, LinkedIn, so on and so forth. I think implementing a good dark web monitoring process to get those initial that initial information that you're being targeted, that they have that information. Valid credentials is something that Josh mentioned. The trick about valid credentials is that it's very hard to detect when someone's doing something bad with valid credentials. The only way that we really can get ourselves, besides heuristics, get ourselves to even look at that user is by having some alert that pushes us towards that determination. And that's the dark web stuff, right? Threat intelligence team sees this user being sold on the dark web. Now we have something to go hunt for. Let's go look at that user's activity to see where it differs and see if we can pick up any malicious activity when it comes to that. Implementing comprehensive cybersecurity measures. We've talked about EDR, UTM firewalls, having a vulnerability management process or system in place is a very good start as well, and making sure things are updated. The educating users, like I said before, educating them on not reusing passwords, educating them on phishing, different social engineering attacks that can take place. And one of the things that we don't really talk about in this report is AI is making this stuff a lot easier to do phishing attacks, to do social engineering attacks, pretend to be somebody you're not. And so collecting more data, more context around someone becomes a lot more valuable, especially when you're trying to pretend to be them, to call in and ask someone to change the password or give you access to something, to be able to build rapport and build up that trust with whatever user that you're dealing with. Becomes a lot easier with that information. And so these are just some things that come to mind when I think about dark web mitigation and response, and things that we can do to kind of be prepared and get ahead of some of these attacks when, on that initial part, when we're just talking about the access brokers and selling those credentials, to triggering us to look into the data that we have for those particular users and credentials and so on and so forth.
And moving on to our next section, the exploit section. When we take a look, when we compare against Q2, we saw about a 50% increase in activity. And we'll jump right into here to discuss why. Some of the things that we saw was the Hikvision Products SDK, which is a fancy thing for basically their security camera products and things like that. That had fallen off last quarter from being one of the top exploits that we had witnessed. It's come back to the front again. And so it does show a renewed interest in the targeting of Internet of Things devices. And one of the reasons why is because they're typically unsecure. They may have old firmware. Sometimes they're set up directly out of the box. And so that leaves them vulnerable. And they may even have some things like default username and password credentials stored within them. And that gives threat actors a foothold into the network. And as we look at some of the other vulnerabilities that we witnessed, specifically here, and I know that's a knee-jerk number right there of a 4,000% spike in VPN-related attacks. That is what the data showed. When we compare against Q2, we saw a huge surge in specifically VPN vulnerabilities. Now, the largest one was the FortiOS SSL VPN. This one is from 2022, but there were other ones that were listed as well within our data. And there has been a huge uptick in activity against VPN devices. It's pretty obvious when you think about it. One of the reasons why, that's your edge-facing device. One of the things that are exposed to the internet. Typically, a VPN port is wide open to allow anyone to be able to connect to the VPN. So if they've got a vulnerability attached to it, these threat actors are going to probe at that and see if they can get their way in. Another thing that we did see throughout the year here so far in different incidents and different reports and things like that is a ton of brute forcing against the different VPN login portals. And so it's a good idea also to make sure you have your MFA enabled within VPNs. If you don't, it's probably a matter of time before something's brute forced or there's a credential leak and that gives them valid access into the network. This particular vulnerability, though, if it is exploited, it does allow the attackers at that point to be able to send malicious requests that can go ahead and install malware, and they can go ahead and get a foothold into the network to be able to launch a ransomware attack, exfiltrate data, really, I mean, whatever it is that they want to do. And so I really can't stress enough in our current threat landscape how important it is for VPNs to be secured and to be a focus on your organization for when new patches come out, and to ensure that you have MFA again enabled with those. They are very highly targeted in these days. One of the things we also always like to cover in our report, because obviously Microsoft has such a huge market share when it comes to enterprises, is the Patch Tuesdays that accumulated over the quarter. So specifically for Q3, there were 286 vulnerabilities that Microsoft patched, with 19 of those being 0 days. 0 day meaning, if you're not familiar with the term, is that it was exploited before the vendor released a patch for it. So with that being said, you need to be keeping an eye very closely on Microsoft patches when they come out. And that again circles back to the things like Justin was talking about with EDR and layers in defense and things like that. Because if you don't know about it and the vendor hasn't released a patch for it, I mean, you can't patch it. So you need to have those other safety nets to be able to catch malicious activity and suspicious behavior. One other Microsoft thing that jumped out to us this quarter specifically is we saw a renewed surge in activity against some older vulnerabilities, proxy shell and proxy not shell. These are 2022 vulnerabilities that target Microsoft Exchange servers. When these vulnerabilities are chained, they allow remote code execution against the servers. And again, that allows them to deploy code. And at that point, they can install malware, ransomware, administrative changes, things of that nature, that gives them the opportunity to go ahead and exfiltrate data or move forward with whatever their goals are. A lot of times these ransomware groups, such as Play Ransomware, have abused this particular vulnerability, and there have been cases and reports out there of once they've used this vulnerability, it gave them initial access, they moved laterally across the network, they deployed ransomware, and they exfiltrated information. And so this is another one that specifically to call out is your Microsoft Exchange servers. If they're exposed to the internet, you need to be on top of patching for those too, because the threat actors are constantly looking for newly announced vulnerabilities for those as well. And kick it back over to Justin.
So when we talk about vulnerabilities and exploits, first and foremost, it's to be aware. You need to be aware that there's vulnerability out there for the systems that you're using. I guess that starts with an inventory list of all the different softwares that you have and what versions they're on, and kind of what their priority is in your organization. What are they protecting? What would happen if they were exploited? And that'll kind of help you get an idea of what you need to prioritize on that side. So monitoring the security news and bulletins that come out through the vendors to see if those monitoring individual researchers. Nuspire has threat briefs that go out around some of these things, but keeping an eye on those things to know that there's an exploit out there and to know that you're vulnerable to that exploit is kind of the first step. A couple other things that we can do is use a firewall with IPS. They have sometimes blocks for particular exploits, or if not blocks, they have ways to detect those so you can alert on them and react appropriately. The other one that's at the top here is speedy system patching is crucial. You don't want to be the last one to patch. You want to be the first one. You want to beat all the other ones to the punch. Josh has mentioned a couple of times through here, it's path of least resistance. They're going to use the easiest exploit on whatever system you have, and they don't care if that exploit is a 0-day or came out 10 years ago. If it's something that they can exploit easily and get some quick financial gains or reach whatever goal that they have, they're going to do it. So part of that's being aware that there's an exploit out there, prioritizing it appropriately, and getting it patched as soon as possible. Another thing here down at the bottom is disabling unused services. If a service or port is not used for business, remove it. We don't want it on there. There's no reason for it to be open. What it does is just opens up places for threat actors to come in and potentially attack a system that no one even knew was there. Some old system sitting in the back room that's never been patched, that no one uses anymore, that's running an FTP server or something like that. So there's that's another thing we can do to help mitigate these different exploits that are out there, and they are being used. They're being used every day. The VPN is super important to take care of. For the reasons that we talked about in the dark web report, we definitely want to have two-factor authentication. A password doesn't matter how many characters there are if the threat actor knows what the password is. And so not having two-factor on that just gives them instant access to whatever VPN system or other system that they want access to. So that's super important to have two-factor on anywhere you're having external people connecting in, and have as much as a zero trust environment when it comes to that as possible. And so that takes us to our conclusion and recommendations. This is kind of going to be a reiteration of everything that we talked about, but kind of in an easier to digest form here. Educate all users often. That's the user awareness piece. That's super important. And it's the first layer of defense that you have before we start getting into the technical things. That brings us to the second point here is take a layered approach to security. As Josh said, if you have a system out there that's vulnerable and you don't know about it, and it gets exploited, what's your next layer of security there? Do you have firewall logging? Do you have an EDR? Do you have other systems that can particularly detect those types of attacks? Third one is patch your tech stack. That starts with prioritizing what to patch and staying up to date on the different bulletins that come out. Update your malware protection often. So if you do have AV, EDR, other types of security devices out there, make sure that they're updated. Those updates have crucial information for blocking things that are new, hashes, rules, so on and so forth. Segregate those high-risk devices. We definitely want to know what our crown jewels are, which is the first part, understand what those devices are doing and what the impact is if they go down. And how you would recover. It's kind of a good way to understand what backups you need and to understand if that device was to go down, how would you recover from that to get back to business operations. And the last one here is utilizing threat intelligence. Dark web activity, IOCs, credential leak mentions, all these things are really good things to either get you ahead of an actual execution of malware, or at least point you to a particular user or activity that needs to be looked into that you would have no idea it needs to be looked into without that information. So utilizing threat intelligence, there's a bunch of open source threat intelligence stuff that can be gathered out on the internet as far as collecting IOCs, looking at your email addresses to see if they're in any dumps or combo lists that are out there for that threat actors are publishing. Those things are super important and will help your organization be protected. So combination of all these things will make you a lot more secure and less likely a target for some of these threat actors and some of these things that Josh has been talking about throughout this webinar.
All right, we are at the resources section here. Thank you both for sharing those highlights and those recommendations. Lots of great information there for our audience from the newest report. If anyone does have any questions, we have a few minutes to do Q&A. Go ahead and type those into the Q&A tab or even the chat. But at this time, I would like to quickly mention our next webinar, which is going to be all about AI in action. And we're going to be sharing some real applications and use cases that can help transform your approach to cybersecurity. I'll go ahead and share the link to that one in the chat in case anyone wants to go ahead and register. That will be November 14th. And then we also have a couple other links to share, and these will all be in the email again. But I'm going to quickly share the link to the full threat report again in case you missed it in the beginning, along with the press release that went out this morning. And I also have included a link to learn more about Nuspire's recently launched Nuspire cybersecurity experience for anyone who may be interested into seeing what's new that we're up to here. So let me post those here. All right. And of course, you can always go to our website. There's tons of other resources there. And we will go to questions. Let me check here. All right, I see a couple questions here. So here is the first question. Given the high scoring of several newly announced vulnerabilities in Q3, how can our company efficiently prioritize which to patch first? I'll give that one to Justin.
I can take that one. Yeah, we talked about this a little bit. Nuspire relies heavily on our threat intelligence team to help prioritize what we need to do. It's basically a driving force. We use something we call priority intelligence requirements to determine what is the most risk to us. And so they work with stakeholders of those different applications and services to determine what needs to be patched first. It can largely depend on the organization, but I think first and foremost is understanding the different devices that are out there, their importance to business operations, and security of data. And then kind of taking it from there, depending on how easy the vulnerability is to actually exploit, can be another way to look at it and another way to prioritize on top of everything else. If there's a proof of concept out there for a particular exploit or vulnerability, that kind of lets you know that the code already exists. So that may be a way that you want to prioritize which to patch first. And ultimately gathering all that data and determining what the right approach is for your organization should rely on a group of stakeholders and possibly threat intelligence that's out there, as far as is there a lot of dark web chatter around a certain vulnerability? Is that vulnerability allow remote execution, or does it allow something else? There's some things that I would think about when talking about prioritizing different vulnerabilities and patching.
All right, thank you, Justin.
Yep.
And then the next one reads, with the increase of VPN-based attacks, what can we do to ensure our VPN infrastructure is secured? And that one will be for Josh.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about some of this stuff too, but to kind of lay it all out, flush, if you will. For starters, patching, which I think we've beaten that pretty well here at this point. But knowing that there is a patch available. So how else that can be twisted is to say, make sure you are subscribing to your security vendor, VPN providers, bulletins. Make sure that those are coming into your inbox, whether you set up Google alerts for if it's mentioned in the news, however you need to be able to find out that a new vulnerability has been released. And here's the real tricky part now, I feel like, especially for administrators, is being able to properly communicate the risk involved without or withholding that patch. And what I mean by that is talking to your stakeholders in your organization, because typically the biggest concern of why VPNs don't get patched is because the operational downtime involved with taking down a VPN system and restricting access to all of the remote users. So you need to make sure you have your ducks in a row to be able to discuss the severity of the vulnerability and why it's so important to go ahead and patch this and what the ramifications can be if they aren't patched. It's always a delicate dance between operations and security and those downtimes needed for patches and things like that. And you need to be an advocate for security on that stance while also having an open ear and understanding the operational requirements of the company. Those are definitely the biggest challenges when it comes to the patch management stuff. And then lastly, I said this before, but I really want to stress it again, is two-factor authentication on your firewall. There are tons of different VPNs out there that folks don't have two-factor authentication on them. I promise you right now, they're being scanned by threat actors. And if you haven't looked at the logs on those, someone is attempting to brute force it if there's not MFA on it. And it will be just a matter of time before that magic combination finally comes up. So again, cannot stress enough about making sure MFA is enabled on your VPN connections.
Yeah, I would add to that, Josh, another thing you can do, and definitely MFA is what the goal is to at least monitor those interfaces to see if they're being brute forced. And it's playing whack-a-mole a bit, but just blocking those IP addresses until you get some two-factor in place. Locking down to particular trusted hosts is another way to help mitigate some of that. GeoIP location for VPN policies is another way to mitigate it. All of those things together with two-factor authentication is going to help a ton. And then some user awareness around things like MFA exhaustion and stuff like that can be used for that initial access is really going to lock down those VPNs as best possible.
All right, thanks, guys. And I do not see any other questions at this time. So we will go ahead and wrap it up. If anyone does have any other questions, go ahead and email us at webinars@nuspire.com. I'd be happy to get those to the right people here at Nuspire, or you can contact us through our website at nuspire.com. Also, upon exiting the webinar, there is a short survey that will pop up, and we'd certainly appreciate any feedback that you have for us today. And with that being said, any closing thoughts from either you, Josh or Justin?
As always, I certainly appreciate people taking time out of their day to come to the webinar and come hear our thoughts. And I encourage you all to go download a copy of the report as well too. There's just not enough time to cover all the meat that's within it. It gets a lot more technical, covers a lot of the TTPs and things like that as well too. So like I said, if you're interested in more detail on what we've talked about today, make sure you jump out there and grab a copy.
Yeah, just to reiterate what Josh said there, appreciate everybody showing up. It's nice to be able to talk about this with everyone and hopefully make everyone a little bit more secure. So stay secure out there. If you haven't, read the report. There's a lot of good technical data in there that can help you out.
All right. Well, on behalf of Nuspire and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.